Full screen sharing for me, Sammy. Or you can share my slides if that's easier.
Okay, you should be good.
Thank you. All right, that looks good. So hopefully you can all see those. Excellent. So I wanted to start actually by explaining my title, A Lion in the Path. This was a title handed down to me by a former boss of mine, a guy named Hunter Rawlings, who was the president of Cornell University and then also the president of the Association of American Universities, which is where I worked for him. And a professor once told him when he was a young philosophy graduate student that when he went on to become a faculty member, he would be giving a lot of talks and he'd be asked for a title long before he was prepared to give a title because he hadn't really had time to think about the talk yet. And he should just use the title, A Lion in the Path, because it's sort of meaningless, but sounds important and vaguely ominous. And it could be taken to mean a lot of different things. And so serves as a good all around generic title. So I have adopted that framework, and now I'm passing it on to all of you for your future career use. But I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about science policy at the NIH and the Office of Science Policy, and what we do, what we work on, what are some of the hot topics of the day, and then let you know how I ended up there, and then happy to dive into some question and answers, and you can ask me anything you'd like. So if you're not familiar with the National Institutes of Health, we are the world's largest public funder of biomedical research. We're part of the US government and the Department of Health and Human Services. We support over $40 billion per year in research and related efforts, so spanning the range from basic fundamental research to clinical trials and therapeutic development. Our mission is really to understand and improve human health and be at the cutting edge of science. And some of you may be familiar with my boss, the NIH Director, Francis Collins, who is sort of formerly known for leading the Human Genome Project, but has been NIH Director for over a decade, spanning now his third administration. So NIH has been in the news a lot, particularly my colleague, Dr. Tony Fauci, of course, over the course of the past year as the world has dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. And NIH has really been at the forefront of contributing to the efforts to develop countermeasures to the pandemic, particularly vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and also helping ensure a health equity lens in everything from recruitment of clinical trial participants to engagement and overcoming vaccine hesitancy and adoption of various vaccines and therapeutics. So we have COVID-19 has really dominated the bandwidth of the agency over the past year, not just in terms of our own agency's response, because we've got 40,000 employees, of course, who we've had to keep safe, but also in terms of the national effort in the pandemic. But this is, of course, the UCLA Science Policy Group. So I did want to talk to you about the NIH Office of Science Policy. You know, it wouldn't be a governmental organization presentation if I didn't show something like an organizational chart. And just to give you an idea of how the office is roughly organized, we're within the Office of the Director at NIH. So NIH is made up of 27 institutes and centers, and they're coordinated through the NIH Office of the Director, and the Office of Science Policy, or OSP, as we like to refer to ourselves, is organized into roughly 5 functional divisions: clinical and healthcare research policy, scientific data sharing, technology transfer and innovation, biosafety, biosecurity, and emerging biotechnologies, and science policy coordination, collaboration, and reporting. Essentially, we're the sort of major advisors to the NIH Director on all policies that go hand in hand with the research that we support at universities like UCLA all over the country. We cover a broad watershed of science policy issues. We're kind of a one-stop shop for biomedical research policy underlying the science that we fund. This is just kind of a laundry list of some of the topics that we cover, and I'm happy, during the Q&A to go into depth on any of these. But as you can see, it's a really pretty diverse array of issues that we get ourselves involved in. And then that leads to the question, okay, well, that's a nice list of buzzwords, but what do you actually do? What does it mean to work on science policy at the NIH? So we have a number of functions. First of all, we work on policy development and input. So this could be anything from developing a data sharing policy, coming up with requirements for clinical trials, biosecurity policies, things to protect humans or animals that are involved in research. And when I think about how that happens, it tends to fall into kind of two major buckets. The first is solving a problem. So policy at the end of the day is really all about behavior change. So how does NIH use its sort of carrots and sticks model of resources and compliance with policy to be the change that we want to see in the world? So how do we get the institutions that we fund and the scientists who conduct the research to behave in the way that we want them to behave to ensure responsible stewardship and ethical conduct of the research that we're funding? Sometimes we also need to develop policy because we're part of the broader US government, and there are laws that Congress passes and subsequent regulations that emerge from those laws, and we need to be able to help write those regulations or create policies in order to implement the laws that that Congress puts forward. So sometimes we're very much reacting to a new statute or an executive order, or working with other agencies to develop regulations relative to biomedical research. In order to accomplish that, we do an awful lot of talking to people. We engage with external stakeholders. We work closely with all of our institutes and centers. We coordinate policy across the NIH so that the research community isn't hit with 27 different flavors of data sharing policy, for example, or 27 different ways to conduct a clinical trial. And we also do an awful lot of reporting in support of that mission. So Congress asks agencies a lot of questions. The administration asks agencies a lot of questions. The public asks agencies a lot of questions, and somebody has to develop answers to those questions. And our office engages a lot in collaborating across the agency to make sure accurate information is coming out of it. We also work across the federal government. So OSP is sort of the main foci within NIH to work with the White House, for example, with the Department of Health and Human Services, other operating divisions. So we work closely with colleagues in the FDA, the CDC, the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, or CMS, for example. And this happens at a lot of different levels. So we coordinate our leadership talking together. We coordinate staff-to-staff interactions or collaborative projects. So we spend a lot of time in interagency discussions. And then we coordinate a lot of agency-wide activities as well. So we, for example, handle the contract for all National Academies activities. So some of you may be familiar with reports coming out of the National Academies. Most of those reports are paid for by federal agencies. And so when NIH wants to sponsor a report at the National Academies, that all comes through my office. We handle the AAAS Fellowship Program, and I'm going to say more about that in a minute. We manage public-private partnerships that occur through the Foundation for NIH. So a lot of just collaboration and coordination across the agency. This involves a lot of meetings, a lot of writing, a lot of brainstorming of ideas and strategic planning. So a lot of variety in terms of the work that we do. Just to give you some recent highlights of some kind of hot topics in the world of science policy, and this is by no means comprehensive, it's just sort of what emerged from my head as I was working on these slides. To give you an idea of some of the stuff we're working on, we recently released, and I'm super proud of this, a final NIH policy for data management and sharing. This is a big deal. This affects essentially the entirety of the NIH research portfolio. It's the first data sharing policy since 2003, the first time we've updated this policy. So it was a pretty major achievement. It took us many years to get there. And essentially, this is a policy that requires researchers to submit, when they submit an application to NIH for funding, a plan for managing and sharing data, with the idea that the default expectation is that you will share your data, and you're going to tell us how to do that. If you don't stick to your plan, that may affect the ability to get future funding from the agency. So this is really aimed to create a culture-wide change to move towards more responsible management and wider access and sharing of data. And there's a lot of details involved in that, but certainly this has been a sort of flagship achievement that has taken place over the last year. Um, we do a lot of work in research participant protection, so making sure that folks who are involved in clinical studies at NIH, people who volunteer for research, have appropriate protections in terms of risk and privacy, as well as accountability and transparency. And in particular, we've been thinking a lot lately about biospecimens. So you may be familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks, who is the woman whose cells gave rise to the HeLa cell line, which is really one of the most ubiquitous cell lines used in biomedical research. Her story, of course, has been told in Rebecca Skloot's book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, and has been highlighted in movies starring Oprah. And NIH has worked quite closely with the Lacks family in agreements about the use of HeLa derived genomic data. But Henrietta Lacks is an interesting story, because essentially what happened to her, in which her biospecimen, which was removed in the course of clinical care, so a tumor specimen, was then used without her or her family's knowledge or permission, to generate this immortal cell line, which was spread all over the biomedical research enterprise. That could actually happen today. It wasn't just that this happened before we had protections in place for human participants in research, though that is also true. The issue with the HeLa cells is they were identifiable by using Henrietta Lacks's initials. Essentially, they could be traced back to Henrietta Lacks. In the absence of that HeLa label, everything else that happened would have been entirely permissible today, because under our current set of regulations, we actually don't require consent for use of biospecimens involved in clinical care. There's a lot of reasons for that, and the U.S. government tried to approach this in a period from 2011 to 2017 in the revision of a regulation that's known as the Common Rule, which is the regulation that essentially protects all the human subjects. NIH tends to like to use human participant instead of human subjects, but subjects is the word in the regulation, that participate in research. And ultimately, that provision to require consent from biospecimens was removed from the rule for both good and somewhat complicated reasons. But this remains something that, as an agency, we're still quite passionate about. How do we make sure that we're moving in a way that acknowledges volunteers in research, participants, as partners, and respects the contributions they're making by asking them for permission in terms of using their biospecimens and data. And so, we're really trying to engage in a national conversation on this topic. uh, sometimes our issues extend far beyond U.S. borders. So another recent example, you may have heard of the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, GDPR. This was a regulation that was really promulgated in response to things like Facebook and other sort of technology-inspired perceptions of privacy violations. But GDPR is a wide-reaching rule, and more importantly, it has flexibility for every nation in Europe to essentially come up with their own interpretation of how you implement GDPR and all of these privacy protections related to data. And importantly, it also carries some pretty major penalties, which makes all the lawyers' ears perk up and get really serious about its enactment. And as a result of that sort of risk-averse response and this variability among nations, GDPR in some cases has really disrupted sort of ongoing research collaborations involving sharing of data and biospecimens between Europe and the United States. And so this is sort of the kind of issue that arises to our level, and the NIH director says, fix this, solve this. And then we do our best to work with folks in the State Department and our international partners to come up with solutions that work in the NIH context.
Oh,
Oh,
wait,
yeah.
can you make me host again? I think I accidentally made you the host.
Oh, sure. Let's see.
If you're able.
Gosh, I don't know if it is going
Just
to.
the three dots next to my picture.
Yes, there you are. Make host.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, hopefully that worked.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Let me see if I can. All right. So moving away from human participants for a minute, there are a lot of sort of constant and super interesting issues in the biosafety, biosecurity, and emerging biotechnology space. And a lot of these end up falling into this broad bucket of how do you balance research progress, particularly with emerging biotechnologies, where you really want to make sure you're maximizing the benefits of use with safety, security, and ethical issues, especially since if these are new technologies, all of those issues might not have emerged. They may be as hypothetical as some of the uses of these technologies. One of the things we've done recently to help address this is form a new advisory committee of external experts to help us think through some of these issues. The NEXTRAC, the Novel and Exceptional Technology and Research Advisory Committee, it replaced the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, the RAC, which has sort of a long and storied history in the science policy world. But essentially, having worked in science policy for a long time, one of the things that has frustrated me in the emerging technology space is that there's often a knee-jerk policy reaction when a new technology emerged. We saw this with stem cells. We saw this with somatic cell nuclear transfer. Back in the day, we saw it with recombinant DNA. And certainly it's come up in the CRISPR context and new gene editing technologies. And so, despite the fact that we would get these sort of sensationalized headlines and knee-jerk policy reactions, it's not like this was new news to the scientific community. They knew this science was emerging. They were the ones doing the science. And so it was like we kept seeing the train coming down the track. And rather than learning to build a station for it and thinking proactively about how we mitigate some of these risks or think through some of the risks, instead we just kept getting hit by the train. So the next rack is really an attempt to build a station and think about where we lay the next set of tracks instead of getting hit by the train over and over again of emerging technology. A lot of conversation, particularly evoked by the pandemic, about what are known as dual use issues. So the idea that research, particularly involving pathogens, could potentially be used for benefit, but could also be misused for harms. And there's a whole set of policy conversations that we get engaged in there. This is just a really sort of nonstop and stimulating area of policy discussions. And there are a lot of sort of nascent policy discussions now beginning to spin up about some of the lessons that we've learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, the pandemic isn't over. And I hope everyone gets a chance to get their vaccination if you haven't already. But there are a lot of interesting things about the research enterprise that we learned as a result of the pandemic, and where there are potentially some opportunities to do better going forward. For example, when we think about clinical trials, suddenly for COVID, we had to set up massive nationwide inclusive clinical trials to be able to test out vaccines and therapeutics across an incredibly disparate and siloed set of trial networks and healthcare systems. And that was really hard. We managed to do it, but it took a huge amount of effort and just sheer kind of political will to be able to make it happen. How do we, going forward, create more of a national network that allows us to be able to launch quickly when necessary large-scale clinical trials in the cause of public health? And how do we make sure that we are thinking from day one about diversity and inclusion? We had a lot of trouble ensuring diversity of our clinical trials and had to launch sort of massive engagement efforts that really had us starting on the back foot in ensuring that the communities, particularly communities of color who were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, were included in the therapeutic and prophylactic trials involved. How do we do that better going forward? How do we do proactive engagement so that we're not starting from a step behind, so that we can move at sort of the pace of trust in going forward? We also saw a lot of well-intentioned but ill-conceived small clinical trials sort of springing up all over the place, hundreds of them. Clinicaltrials.gov was suddenly populated with thousands and thousands of small COVID trials. How do we make sure that the studies being launched really have a high standard of quality so that we can trust the science coming out of them? And how do we build transparency around that to ensure accountability? Data and biospecimen sharing, it became very clear that we didn't have the infrastructure set up to really do the kinds of real-time data and biospecimen sharing, whether that meant actual databases that were broadly accessible, or the data use agreements you need to have negotiated in order to share data between different countries, between different types of entities. How do we make sure we are set up to do that better in the future? And we learned a lot of lessons. We quickly built in sort of record time massive public-private partnerships, among the pharmaceutical industry, between government agencies, involving the biotech sector, involving research institutions, and that was we learned a lot of lessons about how to streamline that process that might be very useful for the future. And then my own sort of personal soapbox in this is within the research community. I think we are seeing some alarming signs of perhaps folks who got left behind in the research community because of the pandemic. In particular, women, people who are have dependent care responsibilities, have really struggled to be able to keep up and maintain productivity and stay on a career path during this pandemic. How can we make sure that, first of all, we're not leaving those folks behind, and second of all, that we are more cognizant of those responsibilities going forward, so that we are not reducing both the gender equity and racial equity space in the research enterprise in the future. So let me pivot quickly to careers in science policy, both some advice for you, a couple of options, and let you know my crazy career path, just to illustrate that all roads can ultimately lead to a successful career. So one of the most common pathways these days into science policy is through science and technology policy fellowships. The most common of these is, or the most well-known of these, I should say, tends to be sponsored by the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. These are policy fellowships for anyone with a PhD or higher degree, really aimed at getting scientists and engineers into the policy-making circles. We hire a lot of these folks at NIH. At any given time, we've got about 40 fellows. As I mentioned, this is coordinated through my office, but it's not just AAAS. A lot of scientific societies sponsor these sorts of fellowships, and they have differing requirements. So real opportunity to dive right in. However, that's not the only opportunity. The National Academies has the Mirzayan Fellowship, which is much shorter term, and also takes people before they've completed their terminal degree. So that's an opportunity to kind of get a taste of science policy at an earlier stage and without as much of a commitment. And unlike the AAAS program, I believe the Mirzayan Fellowship accepts international fellows as well. So just a couple of opportunities there. But as my path will illustrate, there is also the possibility of just coming to Washington and getting a job, which is also always a legitimate pathway to pursue. So how did I end up at NIH? I actually started my career as a zookeeper. Weirdly enough, just going to show there's no one route to science policy professionalism. I was a kid who liked animals and really thought I wanted to pursue a career working with animals. And while I was working as a zookeeper, I met this woman, Dr. Jogel Howard. She was, she's unfortunately passed, but she was the head of the reproductive physiology program at the National Zoo with the Smithsonian. And I really admired her greatly. She did a lot of work for conservation. And I thought, oh, I want to be Jogel Howard, and therefore I want to go to vet school. And so I went to Cornell to pursue a degree in animal science, where I quickly decided I actually didn't want to be a vet. In fact, who I really wanted to be was the next Diane Fossey or Jane Goodall. I will say that in the course of my career at NIH, I have a chance to work with Jane Goodall on a occasion, and I've told her this story, and she has laughed in my face about it a number of times. But I was convinced when I was in college I wanted to be Jane Goodall, and so I tried that for a while. I worked at the Duke, what was then the Duke Primate Center, now the Duke Lemur Center, spending a lot of hours studying these very cute guys. This is the lesser bamboo lemur. And that experience, although incredibly rewarding, was enough to convince me I did not, in fact, want to be the next Jane Goodall or Diane Fossey. But I did still want to do something with animals. And so I sort of headed back to my original thoughts in trying to become Jogel Howard. And I started working in a lab doing reproductive physiology research, particularly on cattle and bats. I was studying sperm storage in bats. And then that gave me the very naive view that, hey, I kind of like research. I was doing some teaching. I kind of like teaching. Therefore, I must want to get a PhD and become a academic researcher. And so I went to Penn State with that very naive point of view, and discovered pretty early on in my graduate career that this was perhaps not the right pathway for me for a number of reasons. But I was pretty stubborn, and I thought, well, I've started on this path. I'm not going to leave without a PhD. And so I stuck it out while feeling kind of panicky the entire time. And then I had a revelation when I actually was getting towards the end of my graduate career and read about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. And I had a eureka moment as I realized policy was what I really wanted to do. That was unfortunate because, in fact, I had already set my thesis defense dates, and I wasn't going to be eligible for the fellowship because they wanted you to have your PhD in hand. However, I really wanted to seek this pathway. So I began doing a lot of volunteering in science policy, and happy to tell you more about that. And ultimately did something which is now seeming very anachronistic, which is I applied to a entry-level job in the Washington Post, the actual newspaper. I like circled it with a marker and everything. You know, newspapers used to be paper and they had job listings. And I got an entry-level job at an organization called FASEB, the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology, in their policy office. FASEB is a coalition of scientific societies. It was a great training ground to really engage in a lot of biomedical research policy issues. And I spent about a decade there before moving on to the Association of American Universities, where I had the privilege, as part of that job, of serving as an organization called United for Medical Research, which was a big NIH lobbying coalition. And in that role, I worked quite a lot with NIH leadership. And so when a job opened up at the NIH Office of Science Policy, they called me up and said, hey, do you want this job? And because Francis Collins is an incredibly persuasive guy, after I took on that kind of major role, when he came and said, would you like a second job being my acting chief of staff? I couldn't say no. And so for the past 5 years, I've sort of worn two hats at NIH in both of those roles. But you've actually caught me in as an interesting time, because 2 weeks from now, I'm actually leaving NIH to go here to the White House to work at the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So this is probably my last public presentation working for NIH. So you've caught me at a good time, and I'm really looking forward to that. I'll be working on a lot of the same issues from a much higher vantage point, and it'll be an exciting opportunity to continue to pursue those passions. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and I would love to hear from all of you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolinetz. That was awesome. I loved hearing about your journey and what the office is doing. It seems super exciting. With that, we'd like to take any questions. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. So you mentioned earlier in the talk that your office often reacts to science-related legislation that the U.S. federal legislature passes, kind of after the fact. But I was curious how often Congress reaches out to the Office of Science Policy at NIH when drafting that kind of legislation in the first place. And if so, what does that look like? And if not, why don't they?
Yeah, a lot. Mostly, actually, they reach out to our Office of Legislation, but we work quite closely with them to provide what's known as technical advice, or TA. So Congress reaches out to federal agencies and says, hey, we're thinking about doing this, you know, what do you think? And sometimes that's just a kind of general concept conversation. Sometimes it is a sharing of specific language for input. We are very fortunate in that as an agency, we have great bipartisan, bicameral relationships with the Hill. And so they are actually quite likely to do that, to ask us our opinion on legislation. You know, the vast majority of legislation introduced on the Hill, of course, never goes anywhere. But we're, you know, just in case, we're always happy to express an opinion when asked. And hi, Sarah, it's nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. I hope you don't mind that I snuck in. Great presentation and congratulations.
Thank you. Not at all. It's lovely to see you. All right, so looking in the chat here, the difference between working in science policy at a place like NIH or other organizations, or even somewhere like the White House OSTP. Well, I can't tell you what it's like to work at OSTP yet, but talk to me in a few weeks and I'll let you know. But I can tell you what it's like sort of from the outside, inside perspective. You know, the advantage of working for somewhere like NIH is you have sort of actual power, right? So I get to create policy that helps shape how $40 billion is spent and can significantly move the needle on the way the biomedical research enterprise works. That's super exciting. It's also, you know, it's constraining in a way too, right? Because it's the Spider-Man principle, right? With great power comes great responsibility. um, I will say one of the things I love about working in policy at NIH, which surprised me actually, because I didn't expect it entering the government, is the real call to public service. I have to say, you know, the job of making sure that that taxpayers, like all of you, get their money's worth out of the medical research that they're investing in, and that we are good stewards of those dollars. That's really important to me, and so being able to actually impact that is incredibly meaningful. That being said, it is still the federal government, and NIH is probably one of the least bureaucratic agencies within the federal government, but that doesn't mean it's not still a bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is often used as a sort of negative term, but truthfully, bureaucracy exists for a reason. You don't really want the US federal government sort of whiplashing between actions. There are sort of slow processes built in for a reason, which are a good thing. But those can be, constraining to work with. Things can take a long time. As a sort of senior government official, there are constraints on what I can do, what I can say. Disclosure. I have a lot of disclosure agreements, and so that can be. That can be a constraint in terms of sort of your life and professional career. I really enjoyed. I mean, I have been fortunate to have a career where I've had jobs that I've loved, and then someone has come along and offered me a better job, and I say, oh, okay. So I mean, I really enjoyed working in the nonprofit sector. Again, there's a similar kind of call to public service working for trade associations or disciplinary societies or nonprofit organizations, because they're very mission focused, and they can provide a lot of room for intellectual stimulus and capacity. One of the differences in a lot of ways, I tended to work in sort of the advocacy side of policy, and I should note that science policy, we refer to it sort of monolithically, but truthfully, there are a lot of different types of science policy careers. Some are very legislatively focused, or regulatory careers, or advocacy careers, or things that are more like communications. I've had a chance to do all of those things. When you're an advocate, you're representing a particular point of view. That's great, because in some ways it's informed by a constituency, and you are taking forth the views of that constituency. On the other hand, you're taking forth the views of that constituency, and so it can be a little more constraining in terms of what your personal kind of intellectual input is. But yeah, definitely pros and cons to both.
Thank you. I had a question, which is that we had a talk from someone who I believe had gone through the AAAS policy fellowship, and he made this distinction that was really interesting to a lot of the audience for that one, which is that it was the difference between science for policy and then policy for science.
Yep.
And it seems like, and his advice was figure out, which one you're interested, but it very much seems like you've done both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So it is an important distinction. The majority of my time is spent on sort of policy for science, policy that really shapes science. But I have engaged in sort of the science that shapes policy, in part because I work for an agency that generates a huge amount of evidence, which feeds into the policy making discussion. I am someone who tends to be I like to work on a lot of different things. I frankly like to be, half a centimeter deep and 1,000 miles wide. I maybe at this point can say I'm a full centimeter deep and still 1,000 miles wide. But some people like to dive really deep on particular topics, and particularly if you've got a great affinity for your scientific discipline, it can be really rewarding to work on sort of the science for policy side of things, where you really get the opportunity to bring the evidence base, to bring the sort of disciplinary point of view into the policymaking process, which is important too, particularly if you're interested in the regulatory agency kind of space. All right. NIH and data sharing. Yes, so quality of mentorship. Oh, I could spend all day talking about this. Sarah, I think has heard me talk about this practically all day. Yes, there are very much conversations about how do we improve not just mentorship, but going to expand this to sort of training overall. So one of the perhaps dirty little secrets of NIH is that when we think about how we train people, so how do we pay for people to be trained? There are sort of two ways we do that. One are on training grants. Some of you may be on training grants. And the other way is through our research awards. And when we tend to implement requirements for training, we typically do it through our training grant mechanisms or training awards. Unfortunately, the vast majority of people who we pay to train are not supported by training awards. They're supported by research grants. And there's a lot of reasons, very wonky reasons about that related to indirect versus direct costs and a whole lot of reasons. But the truth is, when you think about people who are trained on research grants, there are essentially no requirements in terms of the training experience itself. Now, a lot of institutions sort of take all of the requirements related to training grants and stretch them to any federally trained trainee or any NIH trained trainee, but those are very few and far between. And so we talk a lot about, one, how do we at least make sure people who are being trained on research grants meet the sort of minimum standards and expectations we've set for folks on training awards, which include things like individual development plans, which begin to lead towards sort of a practical implementation of mentorship, requirements for safe and inclusive research requirements, environments, training for responsible conduct of research type awards. So we are particularly engaging in these conversations now relative to the equity space, right? So we're thinking a lot right now. You may have seen the recent launch of the Unite initiative at NIH, which is NIH's effort to combat structural racism in the biomedical sciences. And we are examining sort of everything we do, all of the business that we do, and its intersection point with systemic biases built into the way that we allocate resources. And as someone who has this sort of like very overarching view, I will tell you that I see commonalities in these conversations between other issues we've dealt with, things like how do you combat sexual harassment in research? How do you ensure good rigor and reproducibility in research? A lot of these come down to what are our expectations of the way we train people, the way we expect research to be conducted, and we're trying to think through how do we use the tools at our disposal to sort of be the place that we want to see in the universe. This is an enormous culture change and really gets at the fabric of the things that we do and the things we hold near and dear, things like our peer review system, our apprenticeship system of training doctoral students. It's really the idea of, if we could tear down the system and rebuild it today, what would it look like? That's not easy, but there is a lot of commitment and passion right now to changing that. Advice for folks who are interested in transitioning into policy: take any opportunity that you can to write and communicate. So a lot of policy work at the end of the day is being able to communicate, process, interpret, analyze information very quickly. You probably do that as scientists in terms of data analysis, but really being able to convey complicated ideas, particularly technical scientific ideas for multiple audiences is something worth thinking about. Practice thinking about sort of problem solving. So I think the natural sort of training pathway for scientists is to get sort of incremental and more and more minute as you go along. Right, you're trying to solve this scientific question that is an incremental piece of the bigger picture. Think about that in a bigger picture context. What are some of the systemic issues that you see in science, and how would you think about solving those? Is excellent practice. And thinking broadly about policy, there are a lot of opportunities to get engaged, whether that's at your institutional level, even doing things like this, science policy interest groups, getting involved with your disciplinary societies, policy activities, participating in Hill Days, working with your government relations office. There are a lot of opportunities to begin to get some practical experience in policy. Informational interviews so you can learn more about policy. These are all good activities to think about engaging in. Excellent. I'm glad you do writing projects.
I have another question. Okay, so I read that you call yourself the science policy generalist, which I'm assuming is just another way of saying how you're 1 inch deep and 1,000 acres wide, right? But I was wondering, like, if you were able to answer like one scientific question, what would it be?
One scientific question, what would it be?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I would really love to be able to solve the issue of the blood-brain barrier in terms of drug delivery. Yeah, unfortunately, I'm not a neuroscientist, so the odds of me doing that are pretty darn slim. But I look forward to the day someone is able to do that with robustness and veracity.
Yeah, that's a huge, huge problem. Okay, do we have any more questions?
I have a question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Elizabeth. I've already asked.
Yeah, similar to the kind of the question about mentorship before, I'm wondering if the NIH is developing any policies on expanding open access requirements for journals or otherwise like decreasing journal like publishing costs.
Yeah, so NIH, for the longest time, we were sort of the leading edge of open access, and that we had a pretty rigorous open access policy with this 12-month embargo period pretty early on in the sort of open access world. Certainly, there have been a lot of kind of international conversations with the a rise of things like Plan S in Europe, which is a very aggressive model of open access designed to sort of push publishers in that direction that we've been following very closely. As an agency, we have sort of a vested interest in increasing access to federally funded research results, whether that are things like clinical trials results or data or publications in journal. And we've been encouraging the use of things like pre-pubs, for example. And so, we have no immediate plans, but it's certainly something we're always paying attention to. And in particular right now, it's an interesting landscape because in response to some of these more international efforts, publishers are now experimenting with all sorts of different sort of author pays, open access models, which is potentially moving, sort of the price scale all over the place, which we are paying a lot of attention to, just as a collecting the evidence base for whether there might be policy action in the future. And of course, at any given moment when you're a taxpayer-funded research agency, Congress could come out with a law or the administration could come out with an EO that says, do this, and then we do whatever that is. So that is always a sort of open-ended possibility. But on that, since you asked about cost specifically, interestingly, from a research agency point of view, the money issue is kind of moving deck chairs on the Titanic for us. If you think about how an institution ends up paying for journal subscriptions, or how, faculty members at institutions pay, essentially there are two pools of money. There are direct, from the federal funding point of view, direct costs or indirect costs. A movement towards an author pays model, oversimplistically basically moves things from one bucket to another, but they're both our buckets. So, in some ways, that is less of a concern from our point of view than it might be from an individual investigator or an institution's point of view. It's probably not going to move the needle much for us.
No, just interesting stuff with UC had a big negotiation with Elsevier over the past year or so.
Yeah. Yep.
But thank you so much.
Sure. Lauren, did you have another question?
Yes, thank you. So back to the writing thing. So as a group, we often write policy memos that contain policy recommendations based on existing literature, and have even had pretty good success in getting them published recently. So I was wondering if we ever wanted to recommend a policy that fits under the NIH's purview as a group. Is the NIH ever receptive to receiving those kinds of recommendations from early career researchers such as us?
Oh, sure. We love good ideas. Welcome from all corners. We can't officially accept it as advice because there are all sorts of weird government regulations about that, but doesn't mean we don't read it and think about them. So yeah, no, really, really welcome those. Actually, I will say one of the things, and you can talk afterwards with Sarah and see if she agrees with this, that I've been really passionate about bringing to NIH's policy machinery is really engaging with real world stakeholders, right? I actually don't think it serves us well to sit on our kind of ivory tower in Bethesda and have internal conversations and have policies emerged fully formed, like Athena coming out of Zeus's head. I think it's better to start talking with stakeholders and finding out what the practical implications and whether there are proven solutions out there early and often. We don't always see eye to eye. I mean, I think there's always resistance to change, and it's always hard to change the status quo. But that doesn't mean it's not worth understanding what the real world practical impacts are, and how do you mitigate the risk of disruption where you didn't really want disruption, you wanted positive change. So yeah. Please, at any time, send your ideas to NIH.
Awesome, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk, by the way.
Great.
We'll take one more question before we wrap up, if we have any more. Or we can just wrap up. Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wolinetz, for being here. We really appreciate your insight and all of your advice that you've given us. And with that, I'd like to thank all the audience for coming.